"Find me a widow who asks for nothing," the Duke demanded, exhausted by the powdered, grasping hands of London society. He wanted silence. He wanted a ghost. Instead, he got Nora. And Nora brought 3 crying children, a mountain of debt, and a desperate refusal to quietly disappear. Simon, Duke of Ashbourne, hated the smell of lavender water. It clung to the heavy velvet drapes of London's ballrooms, meant to mask the sour undertone of nervous sweat and stale breath. He was 34, wealthy enough to buy small countries, and tired, bone-tired. He sat in the corner of Lord Harrington's library, listening to the muffled scrape of violin strings from the floor above, and felt nothing but a dull, throbbing pressure behind his eyes. "I won't do it again, Finch," Simon said, his voice flat. He didn't look at his solicitor. He looked at the rim of his crystal glass, tracing the cut edge with a thumb. Finch sighed, shifting his weight. His wool trousers rustled. "The estate requires an heir. Your Grace, the Dowager Duchess, requires you to fulfill your societal obligations. You cannot hide in your study forever. Watch me." Simon downed the brandy. It burned, a sharp, metallic heat in the back of his throat. "I don't want a debutante, Finch. I don't want a girl whose head is stuffed with romantic poetry, who expects me to hold her hand in the carriage or pretend I possess a heart that beats for anything other than a balanced ledger. I want peace." "Silence." He set the glass down. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "Find me a widow," Simon ordered. "Someone whose expectations have already been ground down by reality. A woman who knows marriage is a contract, not a fairy tale. Find me a widow who asks for nothing. Set her up in the East Wing. Let her manage the servants and keep my mother satisfied. I will visit her chambers once a month to do my duty, and the rest of the time she will not exist." Finch blinked, his pale eyelashes fluttering against his wire-rimmed spectacles. "That is exceptionally cold, Your Grace." "It is honest," Simon corrected, "which is more than you'll find in that ballroom upstairs. Do it." Across the city, where the coal smoke settled heavy and thick over the rooftops, blocking out the stars, Nora knelt on a warped wooden floorboard. Her fingernails were cracked, the edges raw and peeling from lye soap. She was scrubbing a pot. It was a pointless endeavor. The porridge had burned to the iron, an unforgiving black crust. But she scrubbed, because if she stopped, she would have to look at the empty larder. "Mama, it's cold." Nora closed her eyes. She inhaled the smell of damp rot coming from the plaster walls. "I know, Tom. Can we burn the chair? The one with the broken leg?" Tom was 8. His trousers ended 2 inches above his ankles, revealing pale, knobby joints smeared with soot. He was too thin. They were all too thin. "No," Nora said, her voice sharper than she intended. She wiped her forehead with the back of a wet wrist. "We aren't burning the furniture. Grab the quilt from the bed and wrap it around your sister." In the corner, 5-year-old Lucy sneezed, a wet, rattling sound that made the knot in Nora's chest tighten until she couldn't pull a full breath. At Nora's feet, Sam, barely 2, wailed. He was teething. He smelled of sour milk and unwashed flannel, and his heavy, warm body was a constant, clinging weight on her leg. Nora kicked the pot away. It clattered against the stone hearth. She scooped Sam up, hoisting him onto her hip, wincing as her lower back protested. "Hush," she murmured, bouncing him roughly. "Hush now." Her late husband, a merchant who traded in bad investments and cheap gin, had died of a sudden fever 6 months ago. He had left her with a leased cottage, a mountain of promissory notes, and 3 children who looked at her every morning, expecting her to perform a miracle. She had sold her rings. She had sold the good silver. She had sold the heavy winter coats. There was a sharp rap at the door. Nora froze. Tom immediately stepped in front of his sister, a protective, defensive posture that broke Nora's heart. Debt collectors didn't knock politely, but the landlord did. and they were 3 weeks behind on rent. She shifted Sam to her other hip, wiped her wet hand on her faded apron, and opened the door. It wasn't the landlord. It was a man in a tailored wool overcoat, clutching a leather satchel. He smelled of beeswax and clean linen. "Mrs. Nora Hayes?" Finch asked, taking in the drafty room, the shivering children, the desperate, hollow-eyed woman holding the crying toddler. "If you're here for money, you'll have to take the pot," Nora said bluntly. "It's all I have left." Finch offered a tight, sympathetic smile. "I am not here to take, Mrs. Hayes. I am here on behalf of the Duke of Ashbourne. I am here to offer you a transaction." And 10 minutes later, Finch had laid out the Duke's terms: a marriage in name only, complete financial security, a position as Duchess with all the social armor that provided. In return, absolute discretion, no emotional demands, and an heir. "He wants a ghost," Finch explained, looking uncomfortable. He kept glancing at Sam, who was currently chewing on the leg of a wooden block. "Someone who asks for nothing." Nora looked at the smoldering embers in the hearth. She felt the heavy, aching reality of her life pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at Tom, who was coughing into his fist. She didn't feel insulted by the Duke's coldness. She felt a sudden, terrifying surge of calculation. A man who wanted to be left alone was a man who wouldn't look too closely. "Tell His Grace I will meet him tomorrow," Nora said. "Excellent," Finch said, reaching into his satchel for a coin purse to leave in advance. "I will send a carriage. You can make arrangements for the children to be looked after during the interview." Nora took the heavy pouch of coins. The metal clinked, a beautiful, life-saving sound. She didn't correct him. She just nodded. Ashbourne House was a fortress of marble and silence. Nora stood in the grand foyer, her boots leaving faint, muddy scuffs on the pristine black and white checkered floor. The air inside smelled of lemon oil and old money. There was no draft. It was aggressively, unnervingly warm. "Don't touch anything, Tom," Nora hissed, snatching his hand away from a gilded mirror frame. "It's gold, Mama," Tom whispered back, his eyes wide. "We could scrape it off." "We are not scraping the walls of a duke's house," she muttered. She dragged them down the long corridor behind a stiff-backed butler who looked as though he had sucked on a lemon. Nora hadn't planned on bringing the children. She had paid Mrs. Higgins 2 shillings to watch them, but when she arrived at the neighbor's flat, Mrs. Higgins was face down on her kitchen table, snoring into a pool of spilled ale. Nora had no choice. She buttoned Tom into his fraying jacket, wrapped Lucy in a shawl that smelled faintly of mildew, and hoisted Sam onto her hip. The butler opened a heavy set of mahogany doors. "Mrs. Hayes, Your Grace." Simon was sitting behind a massive desk. He didn't look up from his paperwork. "Thank you, Graves. Leave us. Leave us. Leave us." The door clicked shut. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the rhythmic ticking of a brass carriage clock on the mantelpiece. "Sit, Mrs. Hayes," Simon said, finally lifting his head. He stopped. His pen hovered over the parchment. He stared at the procession standing in the center of his Persian rug. Nora stood tall, though her shoulders ached. Sam was squirming, whining softly as he gnawed on his own fist. Lucy was hiding entirely behind Nora's heavy wool skirt, occasionally coughing a wet, rattling cough. Tom stood rigidly at Nora's side, glaring at the Duke with all the hostility an 8-year-old could muster. Simon's face hardened. He laid the pen down carefully. "Finch did not mention you were a mother." "Finch didn't ask," Nora said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I was explicit in my requirements," Simon said, his tone dropping an octave, cold and flat. "I asked for a widow who required nothing, a quiet arrangement. This," he gestured to the children with a flick of his wrist, his lip curling slightly in distaste, "is not quiet. This is a circus." "You asked for a widow, Your Grace," Nora countered. She didn't sit. She stepped closer to the desk. Widows come with graves, and sometimes they come with what was left behind when the grave was filled. I am not running an orphanage. No, you are running from society. Nora shifted Sam's weight. Then the toddler grabbed a fistful of her hair and yanked. She didn't flinch. You want a woman who won't cling to your arm at galas. You want a woman who won't weep when you ignore her for weeks on end. You want someone who understands that marriage is a ledger, a business arrangement. Look at me. Simon looked, really looked. He saw the dark, bruised shadows under her eyes. He saw the frayed edges of her sleeves, the rough, red knuckles of her hands. He saw a woman who looked like she was holding back a crumbling wall with her bare shoulders. I don't want romance, Your Grace, Nora said, her voice dropping, stripping away any pretense of politeness. I don't want your affection. I have no room for it. But I will not ask for nothing. I ask for a warm hearth. I ask for beef on the table. I ask for a tutor for my son, a doctor for my daughter's cough, and clean milk for the baby. I ask for everything they need. Simon stared at her. The sheer audacity of it knocked the breath out of him. Women of his class simpered. They calculated behind fans and giggled behind gloved hands. This woman was standing in his study, dripping mud on his rug, aggressively demanding his wealth while promising to entirely ignore his existence. You are brazen, Simon murmured. I am a mother who watched her children sleep in coats last night because we couldn't afford coal, Nora snapped back. Her control slipped for a fraction of a second, her voice cracking. She swallowed hard, wrestling it back down. I will manage your household. I will keep your mother at bay. I will bear your heir, if that is the contract. But they come with me. They eat from your kitchens. They sleep in your beds. Sam suddenly let out a sharp, piercing shriek, dropping his wooden block onto the Duke's polished floorboards. It clattered loudly. Tom scrambled to pick it up, knocking his knee into a side table. A porcelain vase wobbled violently. Simon closed his eyes. The headache he had been fighting since the ball flared behind his temples. It was exactly what he hated. Chaos. Noise. Mess. He opened his eyes. Nora was watching him, her jaw set, but he saw the microscopic tremor in her hands. She was terrified. She was cornered, and yet she hadn't backed down an inch. The East Wing, Simon said quietly. Nora blinked. What? You will take the East Wing. It has its own entrance to the gardens. I occupy the West Wing. The children are not to be in the main corridors during my working hours. They are not to enter the library. They are not to disrupt the silence of this house. Simon picked up his pen. If they break anything, it comes out of your personal allowance. Nora let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 6 months. Thank you. Do not thank me, Simon said, not looking up. We are signing a contract. Nothing more. My solicitor will draw up the papers this afternoon. You will move in tomorrow. The transition was violent. Within 24 hours, Nora's chaotic, desperate existence crashed headlong into Simon's sterile, silent world. The first night at Ashbourne House, Nora sat on the edge of a massive, velvet-draped 4-poster bed. The mattress was softer than anything she had ever felt, but she couldn't sleep. The room smelled faintly of lavender, reminding her of the Duke's cold, unreadable expression at the altar that morning. It had been a private ceremony. 10 minutes, a signature in the registry, and a heavy gold band pushed onto her rough, chapped finger. He hadn't even kissed her hand. Down the hall, in the expansive nursery, the children were restless. They weren't used to space. They were used to sleeping in a pile, to share body heat. Nora heard a faint whimpering. She threw off the heavy silk quilt and padded barefoot down the carpeted hallway. She opened the nursery door to find Lucy sitting up in the massive bed, crying silently into her hands. "What is it, sweet girl?" Nora whispered, rushing over and gathering the small body into her arms. Lucy smelled of the expensive French soap the maids had used to scrub her clean. It felt wrong. It felt like holding a stranger's child. "It's too big," Lucy hiccuped. burying her face in Nora's neck. "The dark is too big." Nora rocked her. "I know, but it's warm. Feel how warm it is?" She stayed there until Lucy's breathing leveled out, but as she stepped back out into the corridor, she heard another sound. Footsteps. She froze. The east wing was supposed to be hers. At the end of the long hall, standing in the shadow of a marble archway, was Simon. He was wearing a loose linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked like a ghost haunting his own home. He didn't say a word. He just watched her standing there in her thin cotton nightgown, her hair unpinned and falling in a messy tangle over her shoulders, guarding the door to her children's room like a sentinel. For a long moment, the space between them hummed with a strange, uncomfortable tension. They were two strangers tied together by paper and desperation. Simon raised his glass in a slow, mocking toast, turned on his heel, and disappeared into the shadows of his own empty wing. Nora leaned against the cool plaster wall, exhaling a shaky breath. She had her warm hearth. She had her full bellies. But as she listened to the oppressive, heavy silence of the manor settle back over them, she realized the true cost of her bargain. She hadn't just sold herself to a stranger. She had trapped herself in a mausoleum. For 3 weeks, they existed as parallel lines in a sprawling geometric trap. Nora policed the children with a terrifying, exhausting vigilance, crowned. She kept them in the east wing, barricaded behind heavy oak doors. She fed them in the nursery, terrified that a dropped spoon in the main dining room would breach her contract. She spent her days scrubbing sticky fingerprints off the imported wallpaper and hushing their laughter until her throat ached. Simon, true to his word, ignored them. He left early for his clubs and his counting houses. He returned late. He ate alone. But a house, no matter how grand, is a living thing. It breathes, it shifts, and eventually, the borders bleed. The collision happened on a Tuesday. The sky over London had broken open, dumping a freezing, relentless rain that battered the tall glass windows of the manor. The dampness seeped through the bricks, carrying a bone-deep chill. Sam's fever spiked just after midnight. It wasn't the dull, persistent warmth of teething. It was a vicious, dry heat that radiated through his small body like a coal fresh from the fire. His wails were thin and reedy, a jagged sound that sawed through the oppressive quiet of the house. Nora paced the nursery rug, her bare feet numb. She wore a faded blue wrapper over her nightgown. She bounced Sam, humming a tuneless, desperate melody. Beside her, Lucy was sitting up in bed, crying in sympathetic fear, while Tom stood by the window, his small fists clenched, staring out at the rain, as if willing it to wash the sickness away. "Please, Sammy, please," Nora whispered. She pressed a cool, damp cloth to the toddler's forehead. He thrashed, batting it away with surprising strength, and shrieked louder. The heavy nursery door swung open. Nora spun around. Simon stood in the doorway. He wore a dark silk dressing gown over his trousers. His hair was slightly unkempt, lacking the severe pomade he wore during the day. He looked furious. "The sound," Simon said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, "is echoing through the entire ventilation grate in the library. I cannot hear myself think." Nora's spine went rigid. The exhaustion of the past 3 weeks, the constant anxiety, the fear of eviction, the sheer weight of playing warden to her own children snapped. "Then block the grate," Nora hissed. She didn't cower. She stepped toward him, holding the burning, thrashing child against her chest. "He is sick. I cannot simply turn him off like a lamp, Your Grace. If my son's fever offends your delicate sensibilities, go to a hotel." Simon blinked. Society women did not raise their voices to him. They certainly did not point toward the door and tell him to leave his own house. He looked past her. He saw Tom, stepping protectively in front of Lucy's bed, holding a heavy brass candlestick. The boy was shaking, but his eyes were pure venom. Simon felt a strange, uncomfortable tightness in his chest. It wasn't pity. Pity was useless. It was a stark recognition of survival. He recognized the feral, cornered look in Nora's eyes. He had seen it in the mirror years ago, when his own father had systematically stripped away every piece of joy in this very house. Simon closed the door behind him. The click of the latch was loud. "Put down the candlestick, boy. I am not going to strike your mother," Simon said flatly. He crossed the room. Nora flinched backward as he reached her, but Simon simply bypassed her, walking to the washstand. He picked up a small glass vial of camphor oil the nursemaid had left out, sniffed it, and grimaced. He tossed it into the basin. "Camphor does nothing but make the room smell of rotting pine," Simon muttered. He reached into the deep pocket of his dressing gown and pulled out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap. The sharp, medicinal sting of high-proof brandy cut through the stale air. "What are you doing?" Nora demanded, her voice tight with panic. "Something useful." Simon poured a small measure of the liquor onto his index finger. He turned to Nora. "Hold his jaw steady." "I will not let you." "Mrs. Hayes." Simon met her eyes. His gaze was devoid of malice, completely stripped of the aristocratic sneer. It was purely practical. "My houndsman used this when the pups were burning up with the ague. The alcohol drops the temperature in the blood. Hold his jaw." Nora hesitated. She looked at Sam, whose lips were cracked and dry. Slowly, her shoulders slumped. She shifted her grip, holding the boy's small, damp head steady against her collarbone. Simon reached out. His hands were large, the knuckles prominent. He slipped his soaked finger into Sam's mouth, rubbing the brandy firmly against the swollen, inflamed gums. "Ha!" Sam gagged, sputtering, a weak cry escaping his throat. "Hush," Simon said. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was an order. Surprisingly, Sam stopped thrashing. He blinked up at the massive, shadowed man standing over him. The sharp taste of the liquor shocked him into silence. Simon repeated the motion, his touch surprisingly precise. "You are smothering him in that wool," he told Nora, not looking up. "Take it off. He needs to sweat it out, but he cannot do that if he is baking in sheep's fleece." For the next hour, the Duke of Ashbourne did not leave the nursery. He sat in a stiff-backed chair in the corner, his long legs stretched out, watching as Nora stripped Sam down to his cotton shift and bathed his arms and legs in cool water. The silence returned, but it wasn't the dead, oppressive silence of the empty manor. It was the heavy, exhausted quiet of a crisis averted. Sam finally fell asleep, his breathing evening out. Nora stood by the crib, her hands gripping the wooden railing so tightly, her knuckles were white. "Thank you," she whispered to the shadows in the corner. Simon stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his dressing gown. The mask was back in place. "Do not let him chew on the library rugs. The dye is toxic," he said, turning toward the door. He paused with his hand on the brass knob. He looked back at Nora. The blue wrapper had slipped off one shoulder. Her hair was a wild, dark halo around her pale face. She looked ruined, exhausted, and fiercely beautiful. "Tomorrow night, Mrs. Hayes," Simon said softly, the transactional chill creeping back into his tone. "I will come to your chambers, as per our agreement." Nora's stomach plummeted, a cold stone dropping into a dark well. She swallowed hard, lifting her chin. "I understand." The knock came at 10 o'clock the following night. Nora opened the door. She wore a white linen nightgown. It was high-necked and completely devoid of lace. She had scrubbed her skin raw with soap, trying to erase the smell of the nursery, the smell of poverty, the smell of herself. Simon stepped into her bedroom. The fire was lit, casting long, erratic shadows across the damask walls. He was dressed simply in trousers and a white shirt, unbuttoned at the collar. The silence between them was suffocating. He didn't move to touch her. He stood near the hearth, staring into the flames. "Let us be clear, Nora," Simon said. It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his tongue was strange, sharp, yet strangely intimate. "I do not require you to pretend. I do not want forced sighs or feigned affection. We are fulfilling a contract. Nothing more." Nora crossed her arms over her chest. The honesty of his coldness was jarring, but it was a relief. She didn't have to perform. She didn't have to be a coquettish bride. "I prefer it that way," Nora said. Her voice shook, just a fraction. Simon turned to look at her. He saw the tremor. He saw the way she held herself, braced for an impact, bracing for something to endure. He walked slowly across the room. He didn't grab her. He stopped a foot away. The air between them was thick with a tense, crackling energy. "You look as though you are marching to the gallows," he murmured. "I am a mother who sold herself to feed her children," Nora replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden, defiant pride. "I am not ashamed of it. But do not ask me to smile while I finalize the receipt." Simon's jaw tightened. He reached out, his fingers brushing the fabric of her sleeve. It was a hesitant touch, completely at odds with his usual commanding presence. "I am not your previous husband," Simon said, his voice dropping low. "I am not a fool who drinks away his family's security. I am not a man who makes promises he cannot keep." He stepped closer. The smell of him clean soap, parchment, and a faint trace of brandy enveloped her. "You asked for a warm hearth. You asked for security. You have it." "You will never be cold again. But I asked for a ghost, Nora, and you are painfully, ruinously alive." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle, and it wasn't romantic. It was grounded and slightly clumsy, a clash of two hard, cynical people who had forgotten how to yield. Nora gasped, her hands coming up instinctively to push his chest away, but the heat of his skin beneath the thin shirt stopped her. She didn't push. She grabbed the linen, holding on. There was no flowery poetry in the dark. There was only the rustle of heavy sheets, the sharp intake of breath, and the friction of two lives colliding. Simon was careful, deliberately reining in his size and strength, treating her with a precise, clinical focus that slowly, inexplicably, gave way to something raw. When it was over, they did not cuddle. They lay on opposite sides of the massive bed, staring up at the canopy. The silence was back, but the texture of it had changed. "The boy," Simon said suddenly, his voice raspy in the dark. "Tom." Nora turned her head on the pillow. "What about him?" "He has a mind for numbers. I saw him calculating the value of the silver candelabra in the hallway yesterday." Simon shifted, propping himself up on one elbow. "I will hire a tutor on Monday." Latin, mathematics, and estate management. Nora stared at him. The sheer weight of that promise. A future for her son. An education. A way out of the gutter pressed down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. "Why?" she whispered. "That wasn't in the contract." "Because," Simon said, lying back down and closing his eyes, "if he is going to live in my house, he will not grow up to be a useless parasite. And because you asked for nothing, yet you fight for everything." A slow, treacherous warmth bloomed in Nora's chest. It wasn't love. Love was a luxury for fools and poets. It was respect. It was the solid, unyielding bedrock of a partnership. 3 months later, the Duke of Ashbourne sat at his desk in the library. The heavy mahogany doors were open. Down the hall, a wooden block clattered loudly against the floorboards. A child shrieked with laughter. Footsteps pounded down the corridor. Simon did not wince. He did not close the door. He dipped his pen in the inkwell, listening to the chaotic, messy sound of life echoing through his mausoleum. And for the first time in his adult life, he found that he did not mind the noise at all. Did Nora and Simon's unconventional bargain capture your heart. If you loved this gritty, emotional journey of a mother's fierce devotion and a cynical duke's slow thaw, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with your fellow historical romance lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply human, raw, and captivating tales every week.